My name is Najla Saeed. I'm the author of Looking for Palestine, Growing Up Confused in an Arab American Family. So my book began as a solo performance piece, which I performed off-Broadway in New York in 2010. It was a play called Palestine, and I would actually like to begin my presentation here today by performing the first lines of the play that became the book, because, to be frank, it's a lot easier than trying to find yet another clever way to explain my mixed up identity. So here we go. Until September 11th, 2001, if you had asked anyone to spend 5 minutes with me and try to guess my background, they would tell you that I was a Jew. Now, this may sound rather bizarre coming from a Palestinian, Lebanese, American, Christian woman, but in the standard, stereotypical cultural sense of the word, I grew up as a Jew in New York City. Okay, so I started out as a WASP, though, at an all-girls private school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where I never really felt like I fit in, although I am Episcopalian. I have dark hair. I lived on the Upper West Side in a railroad apartment filled with books and lefty intellectuals discussing politics and Proust. It wasn't until I switched to an Episcopal school on the West Side that was filled with Jewish people that I finally felt like I fit in. My best friend lived in Brooklyn, and her father made Passover food for a living. She invited me to breakfasts and brunches, and we ate lox and bagels on Sunday mornings while gossiping away for hours about the previous night's high school debauchery and drama. I was more likely to say, oy vey, or I'm schwitzing, or a whole slew of other Yiddish words before I would dare utter a word of Arabic. I had kissed more Jewish boys than any Gentiles, all of whom made some comment about our making peace in the Middle East by our actions. And I had been dubbed the one with all the anxiety by the time I was 10. To this day, I have been called a real-life Woody Allen character more times than I would care to mention, and every time I have insisted that no, actually, I am an Arab, it has been pretty much assumed that I'm just Sephardic. And yet, my father is Edward Said, the most famous Palestinian American that ever was. I'll stop with that. I don't want to give away too much of the story. But as a young girl growing up in Manhattan, all I ever wanted to be was normal. In my mind, being normal meant having blonde hair, blue eyes, a last name with a Mick at the front of it, salad dressing that came out of a bottle, a dog, a house, and a dad who was a businessman. Instead, I had black hair, brown eyes, a name no one could pronounce, olive oil and lemon, chameleons, an apartment filled with books, and a dad who seemed to have more jobs and identities than I could ever understand. Like many American kids who have a foot in another culture, I wanted to assimilate seamlessly and easily. And for a while, I succeeded in doing so. But being Palestinian and Lebanese in a Manhattan neighborhood and environment filled with Jewish people at a time where every front page story in the New York Times was about the savage, barbaric people in the country I associated with love, happiness, laughter, and joy, was pretty confusing and unsettling. I was born in 1974, 2 years before a 15-year civil war began in my mom's home country of Lebanon. I began kindergarten in the fall of 1979, a year in history marked by the Iran hostage crisis. I got stuck in heavy shelling in Beirut when I was 9, became a teenager at the time of the first Palestinian Intifada, tried to be a normal teenager during the first Gulf War, and graduated from college in an America that would change forever 5 years later when the events of 9/11 struck my hometown. There was only so much assimilating I could do, given my background and my parents' insistence on asserting their Arab, lefty outspokenness. My memoir takes you along the journey with me of trying to put it all together and make sense of the world, my two cultures and my place in them. And though my father wrote a book called Orientalism when I was 4, that dealt with how the Western world perceives and characterizes the amorphous and mysterious East, and apparently changed the face of scholarship in the 20th century, but I'm not too sure about that. I honestly didn't know what an Arab was, how I was one, let alone why I didn't have magic powers or a genie that came out of a bottle and gave me 3 wishes. I didn't understand why I wasn't a fundamentalist Muslim, a terrorist, or a belly dancer, and why I didn't seem to know any. Throughout my journey, I always would try to find one thing about my mixed-up identity that could help me fit in. When I was with WASPs, it was my Episcopalianness, which is all explained in the book, by the way, because I realize it's a little weird. When I was with Jewish people, it was my neurotic nature and the brilliant, engaged intellectual community in which I grew up. When I was in college, it was the vague Europeanness and mystique bestowed upon me by the knowledge that my father was an intellectual rock star. But when I tried to pursue acting as a career at the dawn of the 21st century, I realized I was forever going to be seen as an Arab American, and I had to try to figure out exactly what that was. I wrote the play to help further the conversation my father began some 40 years ago. I know how intimidating and confusing the Middle East and its history, politics, and culture can seem to those of us over here in the West. And I also knew that despite being born of the man whose books are used in most college courses to explain and clarify the region my parents come from, I too was confused, overwhelmed, and largely uninterested in learning about the region myself. If I, the daughter of the guy who basically pointed out that the media and popular culture in America give us one-dimensional, stereotypical portrayals and images of Arabs and Muslims, if I had actually fallen for those one-dimensional, stereotypical portrayals of Arabs and Muslims, and if I had internalized those images enough to harbor a self-loathing that culminated in my own attempt to hurt my worthless self, disappear, and even take on the suffering of my people through a long, life-threatening battle with anorexia nervosa, then the power of this insidious public perception of my people was far worse than I would have ever thought. The difference between me and my classmates was that I never had a choice in terms of trying to ignore or get overwhelmed by or remain apathetic about Middle East politics. It seemed ridiculously unfair to me, and I whined and complained and lamented my miserable lot for many years, and I kind of still do. But I persisted in figuring it out. I've traveled back and forth to Lebanon my entire life, and it is a place I call home as much as New York City is. I went to Palestine only once in 1992, and the story of that trip is recounted in what I believe is one of the most strong sections of the book. In short, I wrote the play and ultimately my book in order to share my journey with the rest of you out there who don't happen to know how beautiful Beirut is, how welcoming and warm snuggly the Arabs are, how kind and selfless and humane the average Arab is, in my opinion, and how rich and varied our lovely, truly human culture is. I also wrote the book to thank my parents and grandparents for being fierce, proud, kind, rational, patient, and strong, secular humanists in a world that constantly tries to make everyone and everything different into a demonic other. And I wrote the book to help humanize people from the Middle East and help humanize my father, who is as much a loving, doting, wonderful, Jane Austen-obsessed daddy as he was a controversial figure, whatever that means. Sometimes I think that my book is a funny, charming, and accessible, if I do say so myself, Cliff Notes to the Edward Said you have to read in college. I seem to translate his ideas into regular person speak because I think, as most institutions of higher learning seem to think, his ideas are crucial to understanding and analyzing the world in which we live. And I was able to understand everything he said and argued just by living with him for 29 years. So it can't be that hard. I've already performed the play at colleges and universities and have begun speaking to students about it as well, the book. It's having a remarkable effect on young people who read it, most of whom have identities that are more mixed up than my own. I've empowered women with eating disorders, comforted young people who feel equally torn between two identities, and encouraged all of them to speak up and tell their own stories. I write as an American for Americans. I share openly, hugely, and personally, because at this point, I don't think there is any other way to bridge the massive cultural divide between us and them. I am also pretty self-deprecating and random, which is very charming of me. I learned that from my dad as well. And I end up with no real answers to the questions of what my identity actually might be. Sorry to give away the ending, but I think it's worth noting that after all the exploration, I learn a lot, but end up more curious, more intrigued, and maybe even more excited to continue the journey at the end. Thank you very much.